So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Regulation Best Interest Policy and Compliance Series Conference. I'm Scott Bogus. I'll be your MC for the event. I'm a faculty member here at the Macomb School of Business. I'm also director of a new program on securities markets regulation. That program is housed in our Center for Enterprise and Policy Analytics. That program is intended to support evidence-based policymaking, and we do that by joining academics and their research to active policy issues in federal government. This is our first event. It's regulation best interest is the topic, and it's a little bit different than a typical compliance event that some of you may have participated in the past. It's a policy and compliance event, and the reason for that is we think that for industry to better understand how to comply with rules and regulation, it helps to have context on why those rules and regulations exist. We also think it's important that for policymakers and academics doing research in areas of securities markets to be involved with industry, to hear their views and see what they have to say about the policy that's being promulgated. For the past 12 years before joining Macombs, I did in federal government, the Securities and Exchange Commission, so I have been on the rule writing side of policy for many years. And even in the past 7 or 8 months that I've been involved in this initiative, I've learned quite a bit just by being on the industry side and hearing and talking to many of you at this event today. The program that you have, I don't need to say that you have a stellar lineup of speakers. I don't think you'll ever see a better regulation best interest event in Austin, ever. Maybe even anywhere. And what you'll notice from the bios of the people that are on the program is that it's a mix of academics. People have done research on these issues, these long-standing issues. You have regulators who were involved in writing the rules. You'll hear straight from their mouths on what they meant when they put words on paper, and we have people who have lobbied for the rules, people in industry who have to comply with the rules, and they're all going to speak today. Some are very pro-regulation best interest, some maybe less so. There are a lot of views that will be espoused, and we hope, and our goal was to make sure that there was a balanced view of the policy issues around regulation best interest. In addition to the mix of people that are speaking today in the crowd, there's also a mix. We have 160 people that registered for the event. About a third are in-house at broker-dealers, investment advisors, dual registrants. About a third of you are from compliance shops, law firms, or consulting on issues of regulation. And we have over 30 faculty from Macombs, the law school, and other universities here also in attendance to hear about what we're going to talk about today. So I think it's a very novel event. It's a very new event, their first one, so apologize for any issues that we have in running it. We've had a considerable amount of help from the UT Law School, who does this quite a bit. And that's why if you need professional education, we're offering that today. It's on account of them and helping us get that set up. To start the event, before we call up panel one, I want to introduce to you somebody who's been instrumental here in helping us launch this event. His name's Ramesh Rao. He's the McDermott Centennial Professor of Banking and Finance here at Macomb School. Like I said, he was instrumental in helping us launch this event. And he is also director of a new initiative, a new wealth management initiative here at Macombs. It ties in very nicely with the event we're having. And before we start panel one, I want to invite him up and give a few words and talk about that. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Ramesh Rao, and Scott, thank you for that introduction. Scott suggested that I come up and say a few words about a brand new initiative started here at Macomb, and because it fits in nicely, as he said, with the agenda for today. So what I'd like to do, without taking too much time, is to address 3 points. The question I've been asked repeatedly is, what is your wealth management initiative, and why are you doing it now? That's been the most popular question I've gotten. So let me address it. So the Macomb School is starting a broad-based wealth management initiative that's motivated by, for our discussion today, 3 points. First, there's an increasing demand for wealth management across the country and across the world. So there is $67 trillion of wealth that's being transferred from baby boomers to millennials over the next 10 years. And a vast majority of them say they have no experience in wealth management or even financial planning, forget wealth management. And there's a crying need for them to get some help. There is very poor financial literacy across the United States, and there's an increasing sensitivity to getting understanding of how, what one has to do to increase financial literacy. Now, what is happening is wealth management used to be for the uber rich. Now it's drifting downwards, and even with limited means are recognizing the importance of financial planning. In fact, some people argue that lower level wealth people need financial planning more than the uber rich. And the profession at the same time is changing. When the average age of the profession is 57, and people are retiring left, right, and center, and there is a gap, and they want to hire young, new talent that they can bring into the organization, train, and let the organization grow organically. So the demand is great, and we intend to supply high-quality students to meet the demand. On the supply side, the supply is very poor, not just in terms of quantity, but even in terms of quality. Widespread criticism is that in many schools that offer wealth management, it's outside the business school. People in any discipline can take it. Much of it is online, and therefore the students come out with not that much exposure to business and economics issues. So we want to fix that and add quality and rigor to our students and change the mentality that young wealth management hires are primarily for sales. And in fact, we want to change the entire perception that wealth managers are simply salespeople at the lower levels. There was an article in TD Ameritrade that says the profession is going through a crisis and it badly needs a facelift with some gravitas and putting out people with more knowledge. We want to address that too. Third point, the entire concept of wealth management is changing. Years ago, wealth management was associated primarily with asset allocation and portfolio management, and people used to go for advice on what to do with their investment. No one today believes that wealth managers have the ability to generate stock market alpha. Nobody believes that. Instead, the new generation, the millennials, are saying they go to wealth managers to generate something different. They want to get relationship alpha. This is a term I heard recently, and I didn't know what it meant. And the more I got into it, it became clearer as to what this relationship alpha is. Asset allocation and portfolio management is getting increasingly robotized. So people want to go for advice, hand-holding. Literally hold their hands, get into their personal circumstances, and design wealth management strategies, not to maximize dollar amount of wealth, but to achieve life goals. So the new wealth management model is aimed at achieving life goals: education, security, health, family, children, legacy, philanthropy, all those kinds of things. And that is going to take a lot of knowledge, domain-specific skills, and people skills. And we're hoping to provide that today as we create our program. The concept also is that advice is going to change. Advice is going to be very interdisciplinary, and it requires a lot of knowledge. And we think that a wealth management initiative can take some steps to address these issues. So what is our wealth management initiative? Our goal is to create a wealth management center that will rest on 4 pillars. The first pillar is student education. We have created a BBA minor, Business Administration minor, in wealth management with a carefully designed set of I can talk loud. With a carefully designed set of courses that can meet the needs of wealth managers. Yeah, it's back. To meet the needs of the wealth management industry. So that is already in play. And right now it's open for accounting and finance students, and the economics department wants to collaborate with us and get their students also into the program. We're also planning a financial planning lab that we hope to announce soon, and it'll have the state-of-the-art financial planning software to help people plan for the futures. I won't go into more detail here. I'll shift to the next pillar. The next pillar is community outreach. The university is mandating more financial education for non-business students, and this is coming because the U.S. Treasury Department and the state of Texas are mandating that all students get a little more financial literacy. So we've created a personal finance course for non-business students, and we hope to expand that to athletes and doctors and so on and so forth. Third, we're creating a wealth management network. The wealth management industry is very fragmented. People don't talk to each other as much as they should. And so we plan to create a consortium of firms, first in Austin, then later on across Texas and the nation, to exchange ideas, share best practices, and so on. And that's beginning. Finally, our goal is to reduce the wedge between academia and profession. There's a lot of research going on in academia that the profession needs to know about. And the profession has got a lot of data that academics need to do their research. And the idea is to bring them together and add value to the profession. I'm running out of time, so let me do this. So that brings us to today's agenda, which is about regulation. It's all about advice. And some people I talk to tell me that the Reg BI is a really big deal. It's going to affect the way business is done, the way people give advice, and so on. Others tell me, nah, it's really a piece of paper, and only BDs will benefit, RIAs don't. And others tell me that it's going to increase litigation risk. I have no idea what is the correct answer. And I, for one, I'm here to learn about all that. And we have a stellar panel that can educate us about all these matters. Let's get to the business of the day. Panel one, can you please come on over? So as panel one is walking in, let me introduce you to Jim Burns, who is going to be coordinating the panel and conducting the events for the first panel. Jim Burns is a partner at Willkie, Farr, and Gallagher. He counsels investment managers, broker-dealers, self-regulatory organizations, and other registered entities on regulatory compliance and enforcement matters. Prior to joining Willkie, Jim served as Deputy Director of the SEC's Division of Trading and Markets and was Deputy Chief of Staff at the agency before that. He provides clients, including boards, with insights into current issues and SEC examination and enforcement issues, as well as strategic advice on the effects of agency initiatives on the business operations and compliance programs of all registrants overseen by the Division of Trading and Markets and the Division of Investment Management. Now, let me get out of the way and hand it over to Jim Burns. Jim, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor Rao, very much for that kind introduction. Before I introduce my panelists, could I say a quick word? Scott was very gracious about the people who've come to be on the panels today. A word should be said about Scott. The loss in DC can only be offset by his arrival here. Folks, you have got a terrific new member of your faculty, a world-class economist, someone who brings an extraordinary breadth of experience. I know of no one who knows as much about the SEC and its inner workings, and just a good guy. So for his students and his colleagues, kudos to you for having him. And Scott, thank you for having us all here today. So very quickly, let me introduce who I'm on the panel with. I'm going to start on my far right, Dan Kahl, the Deputy Director, and I believe still Chief Counsel within economy within the agency. Chief Counsel.
Taxpayer money left and right.
I'll put in a word to Pete. And formerly an Assistant Director in the Division of Investment Management, where he was involved in investment advisor rulemakings back in the day. Next to him, Rydzewski, General Counsel of the CFPB Board. And Leo, among other things, has been very busy at work on new standards that CFP has been promoting in connection with the promulgation of Reg BI. Leo, it's terrific to see you here today. On this side of me is a retiree who's going to talk about some of the challenges of, no, I'm just kidding. Tom Selman, who was for about 25 years, I think, at FINRA, where he was Executive Vice President towards the end of things, of regulatory policy and the legal compliance officer. And I believe you are actually a UT law grad.
Right.
That's that
Very
right?
proud UT law grad.
Excellent. So alumni folks, hit him up afterwards. He's got a lot of disposable income. You want to hit him up. And then finally, to my far left, Ira Hammerman, who is an Executive Vice President and the General Counsel of SIFMA, the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Authority. Ira has she's been there 20-odd years or so, and just an extraordinary range of advocacy work that SIFMA has been engaged in and been very involved in thinking through these issues. From the point of view, for those of you who do not know SIFMA, as I will call it, SIFMA and FINRA sort of are on sort of the broker-dealer side of the house. Good to see you. And I will also note for everyone that the folks who are titularly here as the fiduciaries are wearing the ties. The broker-dealers are not wearing ties because they believe in choice. I think that's what we will. And you should read nothing into this. I'm just a lawyer. I sell my wares to whomever will hire me. Let's jump right in. I think it's probably just as a very quick table setting exercise, because the meat really here is with this gang, the people who are going to be talking. But back in June of 2019, the SEC promulgated 1,365 pages, that's about 13 pounds, on regular-sized paper of rules and interpretation, 4 parts, comprising regulation best interest, as well as an interpretation of fiduciary duty and certain interpretations for broker-dealers, as well as a new disclosure form CRS that advisors and broker-dealers are going to put out. And when that came out, it really, the idea, and that was a culmination of a many, many, many years process, but it established and set out a market conduct standard for broker-dealers, moving essentially from an arm's length suitability standard to a best interest standard of conduct. It's coming into force June of this year, end of June. It's going to apply really in the retail as distinct from the institutional space. And it grounds us in a new core best interest obligation with a series of sort of subordinate obligations around disclosure, the amount of care you're supposed to exercise, reckoning with and disclosing conflicts of interest, and complying with the new regulatory. And so that's what we're going to kind of set the table for and talk about today as really a springboard for the other deeper conversations you're going to get over the course of the day. We're also going to touch, albeit only briefly, I think, on an effort that arose, was put down, and is coming back again from the Department of Labor in respect of duties there. And we'll also probably touch a little bit upon, because those of us who've lived with the SEC for a long time know that once a rule comes out, wait a little while and someone will challenge it. September of last year, after the rule was promulgated, I think it was around the 9th, about 8 states came along and challenged the rule. They found grounds for challenging the rule. And the next day, a couple of folks on the private side came out and challenged the rule again. So we might try to tease out from people here a little bit about what they think about the prospects of those challenges, because of course there are huge players in industry who are changing what they're doing. Decisions are being made while a rule that is final in the eyes of the SEC, it nevertheless may suffer the fate of some of the agency's other rules over the years. So I hope that helps. I wanted to do that just very, very quickly, give you kind of a basic foundation for those of you who haven't read briefing materials in advance. And just because it's kind of fun to do this, I'm going to try to ask these questions in what feels to me like a provocative way. So let me do that. We've got 1,300 pages, 13 pounds, a lot of work that's keeping a lot of people like me and others, some of my fellow practitioners in the room, very, very busy. Ira, let's talk a little bit about Reg BI just as a general matter. Is Reg BI serving an important public policy purpose, or is it a rule in search of an issue? And I'm going to add a kicker to that at the end. Why didn't the SEC simply go with a fiduciary standard?
Okay, thank you, Jim. And I want to add my thanks to Scott for inviting me and SIFMA to be here, and congratulate you on assembling a terrific program. So I look forward to learning and hearing from others. As Jim said, SIFMA is a trade association, but I'll modify slightly what he said. We represent both the broker-dealers and the investment advisors. So when you think of preserving customer choice and customers being able to have a brokerage account or an advisor account or both, that's what SIFMA's members do. We have about 300 or so firms that are regulated as both broker-dealers and RIAs. In terms of the question about Reg BI, I think it's a major undertaking, and I think I realize you're going to get down in the weeds with many of these other panels, but if we can just take a quick moment to reflect on this running debate. The IA-BD debate has been going on certainly for my entire career from the early 1980s, and as I read up on it, they were debating this issue back in the 40s when the Advisors Act came out, and there were some scholarly pieces about it. From my vantage point at a trade association, I've called on every SEC chairman since Bill Donaldson. And we've talked about this issue at that level for each of those varied tenures. So I give Chairman Clayton a tremendous amount of credit for getting a substantial, significant final rule over the goal line. I mean, I can remember conversations with Chair Shapiro, Chair Walters, Mary Jo White. It took her several years to come up with her own personal view that there should be something done in this space, but she couldn't get the votes. And for Chairman Clayton, who, as you all know, came to the SEC more as a corporate lawyer, I would not have pegged him as someone very steeped in the wealth management and the individual investor kind of issues that we're talking about today. From the get-go, he was sworn in May of 2017, and in June of 2017, he went out with a comment letter process. There wasn't even a proposal. He just wanted to hear from everybody. Hey, we've been talking about this for 40 years or so, and give me your thoughts. And that, of course, led to the June of 2019 final rule that you referenced, with an implementation date of June 30 of this year. So I do think this was a material, significant change. I know from my members and the literally hundreds of people at these firms spending thousands of hours trying to implement the rule, take a soup to nuts review of their policies, procedures, the products they sell, the pricing thereof, the platform that they offer. This is a big deal. And many firms had a bit of a head start from the DOL exercise of several years ago. Others are playing a little bit of catch up, but make no mistake, this is a significant development in the wealth management space.
Thanks.
So first of all, I have to give my disclaimer. My views are mine alone, don't represent the staff, the SEC, or commissioners at the SEC, and never more so on an issue that's under litigation. That disclaimer is true. These are my views alone.
So this ought to be good.
Absolutely not. But to your point of search of an issue, and Ira's absolutely right. This is a long-standing debate in Washington. It's been around as long as my career, and I've been to the commission for 18 years, 19 years. The issues, I think, have sort of come more to the forefront over the last decade when you have advice and brokerage, sort of concentric circles and services being provided to investors. And the issue very much came to the forefront and has been debated or talked about a lot is investor confusion. And that alone seems to be reason enough to do something. And as a result of this rulemaking, the hope and design is whether you're receiving advice from an advisor or recommendation from a broker, that advice or recommendation is in your best interest. So the underlying principle, I think, is a very noble one. So getting to your point, was it a rule in search of an issue? I absolutely don't believe that's the case.
Leo, what do you think about the confusion point? Where we are now, are we palpably better than we were before in terms of investor confusion around, I think Dan's laid open a very important issue.
First of all,
You're
Well,
gonna
they're
get a
working
mic.
on that. I thank Scott for having me. I appreciate it. I can make this short. As an alumni of a former Southwest Conference foe, I'm thrilled to be in Austin for 48 hours and enjoying the barbecue and hopefully better weather next time.
okay, it looks like I got the mic here. So thank you, first of all, Jim, for inviting me on the panel at the University of Texas for hosting this event. And I was really excited to hear the opening discussion about, the expansion at UT into wealth management, although I have to say, I might encourage you to use the words financial planning because it really sounded a lot like that's what you were talking about. So the SEC had an enormous opportunity here. The opportunity for the SEC was to implement Section 913G of Dodd-Frank to establish a uniform standard of care that applies to both broker-dealers and investment advisors, and to close the regulatory gap that exists between those two. And what we got is Reg BI. Now, Reg BI has positive elements, but Reg BI is not a fiduciary standard. The words best interest that Reg BI uses is not defined. The SEC hasn't said how Reg BI is different from fiduciary, or even in fact how it's different from suitability. And the investing public is going to continue to be confused by these different regulatory frameworks that both cover investment advice. So there are three major regulatory gaps that Reg BI is intended to, and maybe does not, or maybe it does address. And the first is this issue of investor confusion. Because what you have is you have people who are, the broker-dealer community is permitted to advertise and market themselves as advisors. The sales pitches are all about the advice that's being provided, yet the underlying regulatory framework remains a regulatory framework that's based upon them being salespeople. And then the second major regulatory issue is just the problems and challenges that come with the conflicts of interest that occur that provide incentives for individuals to provide advice that's not in the consumer's best interest. And then coming back again to the consumer, what is the consumer's perspective on this? They don't understand the difference between these. They don't understand that when they're meeting with somebody who's regulated on what amounts to an underlying framework that's based upon a sales type framework, that they don't understand that the person they're working with isn't required to act as a fiduciary. All this is, you can take this back historically. You can go back thousands of years for how this works. We all know that when you think about the relationship that exists between the advisor and the client, where there's this, asymmetrical levels of information. And you have the advisor who has the greater access, the greater knowledge, and the consumer who does not. For thousands of years, we've recognized that when you're involved in a profession, that what happens then is that you have this relationship of trust and confidence. And so what happened, everybody's aware that the DOL rule was struck down. And what happened then? Well, the DOL rule was struck down because one of the main reasons, because the idea that people operating in this business model don't have that type of trust and confidence. But then again, what does the consumer believe? From the consumer's perspective, how does that work? 4,000 years ago, we all know that happened with the Romans, but I looked back at this recently, and this notion goes back all the way back to Hammurabi's Code. Back in Hammurabi's Code, this very principle was adopted. Now, they didn't have very strong trade associations back 4,000 years ago, so maybe that's the underlying difference. I don't know if that's what it is. But this relationship of trust and confidence requires that there be this fiduciary duty. And the real struggle that we'll have is that we don't yet know, will Reg BI live up to the promise? How far will the SEC go in interpreting and analyzing Reg BI? How far will it take us? And until we have the enforcement, until we have additional guidance to come out, I think that question will remain open.
Thanks, Leo. Tom, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can. I left FINRA a week ago, and I can feel already that I'm going to be like Prometheus Unbound. I can say whatever I want now. So there are a few things I want to say, a couple things in response to what Leo said. First of all, I think there's tremendous value in regulation best interest. It, first of all, imposes a best interest standard on broker-dealers, which many broker-dealers, certainly the more compliant ones, have already felt that they have owed to their customers for many years. It augments the current standards in very specific ways. You compare the suitability standard that we had, for example, at FINRA, to what regulation best interest imposes, there's some very key, important changes that it adds that you'll hear through the course of this conference. Excuse me. As to the questions, there are a couple of questions I do want to talk about that Leo raised. First, the question of regulatory confusion is an interesting one. As you'll find out, regulation best interest, in fact, addresses that issue in limiting the ability to use the word advisor by folks who are not, in fact, registered as advisors. But to me, there's a more philosophical question, which I've always asked about the regulatory confusion question, and that is, if you have two systems of regulation and investors are protected under each system, and each system is designed for a different type of business, how important is it that a customer understands under what capacity the person is acting? And it's a bit of a controversial statement, perhaps, and certainly the customer needs to be informed about the services and the fees and the risks and all that, but in terms of the degree of regulatory protection, how important is it that a customer know that on the one hand, the customer is protected by a best interest standard, and on the other hand, the customer is protected by a fiduciary standard, if in fact each of those standards adequately protect the customer in those business models? And that's the essential question. Will these standards work? Not whether we're going to impose on the customer the burden of understanding those standards. So I don't understand, and I've never understood why the regulatory confusion issue is considered to be such a significant one unless we think the standards are inadequate, as Leo and others may feel with regulation best interest, but I don't. The second point I want to raise is that I do agree with Leo that there's a regulatory gap issue that needs to be filled. It still really hasn't been filled, but the regulatory gap issue is not a gap in terms of the need of the broker-dealer industry to catch up, but in fact the need of the investment advisor industry to catch up. The SEC did a great thing by issuing the fiduciary notice to clarify the standards for investment advisors. But the fact is that the cycle of examinations of retail investment advisors by the federal government is still very long. It's a very long cycle. I don't know exactly what it is now, but historically it's been 10 or 11 years that a typical retail investment advisor gets to wait before he or she is examined. At the state level, there's virtually no data available, and for all we know, they're never examined at the state level. So the examination cycle is a real problem, and that's a gap that needs to be filled. So I do agree that there's a gap. I just happen to feel it's a different one.
Hey, Jim, first of all, I very much like that Tom is now retired because he's talking from my talking points, which is great. Look,
Wait, remember there's a disclosure kind of.
I think at the heart of what Chairman Clayton and his fellow commissioners that voted for the proposal were trying to accomplish is preservation of customer choice. I think we should give investors, notwithstanding the need for additional financial literacy, which I agree with, we've got to give customers a little bit of credit here. Many customers understand that if they buy a municipal bond and they're going to hold it for the duration until that bond matures, paying a one-time markup or commission to have that in their portfolio for the next 5-7 years, they're okay with that. As opposed to having a registered investment advisor actively monitor that same investment and charge them X basis points a year for every year that accredited, highly rated muni bond is in their portfolio. Another quick example, I'll make it personal with me. I have some equities in my portfolio that I've had going on 20 years. I'm not selling these equities. I don't want to pay a money manager, and I do have a money manager RIA account. I don't want to pay him 1% or 1.2% a year for me holding these names that I'm comfortable holding and maybe even get to pass on to my kids someday. So preserve the choice, and that's what Chairman Clayton was trying to recognize. Don't treat everything as financial planning. Don't treat everything as subject to the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. Congress saw the wisdom of having a broker-dealer regulatory scheme, an investment advisor regulatory scheme, different ways to pay for these services. Preserve that, enhance the broker-dealer standard. That's what Reg BI is all about. We can talk about why the chairman didn't go the uniform route and treat everything the same. He was trying to get something over the goal line that increased the standard. Yes, there's still a lot that needs to be determined through examination and enforcement. That's unfortunately, part of the normal life today. You get the rule, and then you want to see what the rule really means, and you find that through risk alerts, if OC does a risk alert, or FINRA sometimes goes out with interpretive advice, and then there are exams, enforcement, and ultimately litigation.
I think for the first time ever, Ira's stealing the SEC's talking points. Because I was very much going to say investor choice is very much at the heart of what we were doing. And if you look back at the open meetings and the releases themselves, underlying it was you had the DOL rules going into effect. And there was indicia that there was going to be a real impact on investor choice of a true fiduciary, sort of straight advisors act like Fiduciary Standard on the brokerage community that, whether intended or not, was going to have real consequences on access and delivery of brokerage services to many Americans who would prefer that.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, 1 second, Ira. The examination question. I know those. There were some stats that Tom threw out about 10 to 11 years, but I know your team has been working very hard to increase the frequency of advisor examining. What's that figure roughly looking like today?
So there's no routine cycle, and we're very risk-based. So we get to about 15% of advisors every year, whether that covers the 13,000 advisors every 5 or 6 years. It's very much risk-based. So there are advisors that will go longer than if you do the math, probably every 6 years, then some that go much shorter. So it just varies.
Okay. Sorry, Leo, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I know that the stated reason, or one of the stated reasons, was this idea of investor choice, but I really don't see it being that way. The fiduciary standard is a standard. It's a flexible standard to comply in different business models. In fact, while IRA and SIFMA now are saying that this investor choice dictates that there should be, 2 different regulatory frameworks, that wasn't always SIFMA's position. In fact, SIFMA had gone to the SEC and advocated for a uniform fiduciary standard that would, apply to both broker-dealers and investment advisors. And that model is the model that, that vision that could have fulfilled the promise of closing this regulatory gap that exists between the two of them. But, the fiduciary duty, it's a principles-based standard. There's nothing inconsistent at all with the fiduciary duty in a transaction-based business model.
Can I throw it, just because choice is something I think we could talk about for a long time, and For those who haven't, this is a wonderful master class for folks on the way this issue's been duked out for a long time. I want to dig into one particular because we've got a bunch of economists around here, I think, and they know a lot more than people like me. I'm just interested in the early signs, this idea of choice. Are we really seeing in the early offings, is the rule succeeding in terms of, let's just stipulate for a second that the stated goal of the chairman, let's preserve investor choice. Are we preserving that, or are we, when I was at the agency, I remember there was a really palpable demographic shift away from the broker-dealer model towards the IA model. Are we seeing the rule are we seeing early signs that investor choice is being preserved, or are we seeing a migration of financial professionals to one side of the house or the other, or accounts from one side of the house to the other? Tom, I don't know whether you took a look before you left, or Ira, you might have a view.
I mean, yeah, I'll start and others can jump in. I think, first of all, when I think of investor choice, I'm not thinking of in choice about the choice standard. Because then, again, my mantra has been that we shouldn't leave to the investor the decision to make a legal decision about what protection the investor wants. The investor should be equally protected on either side. The choice I'm interested in is a choice of investment service, wealth management service, and the choice of products. I think regulation best interest does do a lot to preserve that choice by recognizing the differences in the different types of services on the brokerage side and the investment advisor side. I think there's certain aspects of regulation best interest compared to the fiduciary standard that does, in my view, still encourage flight over to the IE side. Probably the most significant one to me is the fact that an IE rep who has a conflict generally may have that conflict disclosed, whereas a broker-dealer rep has to make sure that conflict has to be mitigated by the firm, which can be a significantly different burden for a broker-dealer as opposed to an investment advisor. But with those exceptions, for the most part, it does help preserve the ability to have two different types of services, many types of services within those two realms, and to have a choice of product. Having said all that, the flight on the IE side is continuing. I don't think it's going to slow down. Most of it is economically driven. And on the other hand, we haven't seen the developments on the IE side in fee compression and other things that may slow down some of the flight. But I think overall the flight is still continuing.
Jim, I think your question, which is an excellent one, you could have asked that well before Reg BI being in our nomenclature, because that trend has been going on for many, many years now. Tom, when I think of how many registered broker-dealers there were or used to be in the NASD FINRA heyday, something like, 6,000 broker-dealers, registered broker-dealers, and now what, we're in the 3,000s?
Yeah, tracing it from the beginning of my time at FINRA to the broad format, because I was there.
Exactly. So there's been this migration for many years for a variety of reasons. Some we've touched on in the discussion. On the one hand, if you're a broker-dealer, you're going to be visited by FINRA on a regular basis, by the SEC on an occasional basis. If you're on the RIA side, historically, it was once every 10 or 11 years. Those stats are getting better and on a risk base, as Dan reminded us. But if you want a less friction regulatory environment, the RIA model is certainly the way to go when compared to the broker-dealer model. And a number of talented folks are jumping with their feet, and they're starting their own RIA businesses. That's a trend that happened well before Reg BI was proposed or got over the goal line. Then the question is going to be, okay, Reg BI goes into implementation June 30. What's life going to be like under the Reg BI regime? What will the exams, enforcement, and risks associated with operating a brokerage model under Reg BI be like? And if it gets too burdensome or risky, then none of us can be surprised if firms or individuals opt to be RIA only So they'll be subject to the fiduciary duty. Many of them will charge asset-based pricing. The problem, and now I come right back to the preservation of choice, the problem is under that scenario, the individual retail investors that don't have hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to invest, but have literally $25,000 in an IRA brokerage account, where are they going to go? Who's going to take that relatively modest account? And the concern, and this was the same concern we had in the DOL days, is that those folks are basically going to be left on their own. And talk about hand-holding in wealth management, that there's a value to that. And folks who are left on their own are going to be more likely to sell in a panic situation as opposed to holding on for the long term.
So before I talk about where CFP board sees the industry moving, I want to address a point that Tom's made a couple of times with, what can we expect the consumer to know and understand? And at the basic level, Tom's accurate that the consumer is not going to be able to read how many thousands of pages of paperwork are we talking about with regulation, understanding all the permutations of that. But what the consumer needs to know is the person I'm working with, do I have a relationship of trust and confidence with this person? Can I rely on them in that way? And does the regulatory structure address that and provide for that? And until we see where Reg BI goes through enforcement, ostensibly it could be done through guidance, we don't know whether that's going to be true. What we see at CFP board is a trend, and here's the trend. The trend is toward providing advice that integrates relevant elements of a client's personal and financial circumstance, through financial advice. That what clients are looking for more and more is a more holistic approach to the advice that they're getting. And if that language sounds familiar, it's because at CFP board, what we do is we certify financial planners. And that's effectively what financial planning is. And as you see that movement, and we see it occurring on a daily basis, more people want to have CFP certification to develop that competency, deliver those financial planning services. What you'll see is that more and more people are moving into that framework, but it doesn't mean by any means that the other business models aren't important and valuable and very useful for the consumer. So it's not that one is going to displace the other, but what we're seeing is just this trend, though, of the consumer wanting to have somebody with whom they can work with, to have that trust and confidence, to look at their entire financial picture to help provide advice for them.
So, Dan, could I ask you, just for the benefit of the larger group here, can you give us a rough rundown between Reg BI and the common law fiduciary standard as further, talked about in your releases, a sense of whether the conflicts that are addressed under BI are the same, are they different? Give us some sort of broad.
So, from my perspective,
From your perspective.
and a lot of the points here are very relevant. There's going to be development through enforcement, exam, and perhaps private litigation as well. But when you look at what a conflict of interest is, there's very little sunlight, no sunlight between an Advisors Act conflict and a broker-dealer conflict under Reg BI. The differences are, what does that mean? And there are different obligations as an advisor under 206 and your fiduciary duty and capital gains than under Reg BI. And it's laid out, and there are panels that will get into all the details of Reg BI later, but whether you eliminate, mitigate, disclose, or address, those concepts are not ensconced in rule under the advisor's principles-based fiduciary duty. So there's different ways of approaching the conflicts, perhaps. We'll see how the industry develops. The Commission prohibited certain conflicts of interest in Reg BI. The Commission doesn't prohibit conflicts of interest in the Advisors Act space under 206. It's disclosure, consent. Obviously, there are issues that in the interpretation lays out what is effective disclosure and consent, but there's no per se prohibition under 206(1) and 2, which is the Advisors Act fiduciary duty, unlike Reg BI. So when it comes to what is a conflict, it really is, I see no difference. But there's QBD, enforcement and exam, to develop.
Anybody else on that before we jump to another hot topic for you?
Can't wait.
Hot diggity. The Department of Labor, they put out a rule, gosh, when I was still at the agency. They were working through that. And in fact, I remember right at the transition of the administration, then Secretary Acosta said, we're going to run with that ball. And then that rule is gone and another is in the offing. Any observations, any thoughts or concerns about the new Department of Labor rulemaking? What are you hoping to see? What are you concerned about seeing in this area? And Ira, I'll start with you.
Well, look, I mean, just again, to revisit history quickly. So you had the Dodd-Frank Act signed into law in July of 2010. It ran for whatever, 2,000 pages. I don't know what it weighed, Jim. If the SEC Reg BI was 13 pounds, it must have been, 15 or 16 pounds. A big piece of legislation, most significant financial rewrite of our laws since the Great Depression. And guess what words were not in the Dodd-Frank Act? Department of Labor. Okay, it was the SEC that got the nod from Congress to look at the issue that we're here talking about today. Standard of conduct between brokers and advisors, do a study, the authority to do rulemaking, all granted to the correct federal agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. But some 2 months later, I think, in September of 2010, the DOL, for the first time since 1974, thought, you know what, now's a good time. Let us rewrite what it means to be a fiduciary under ERISA. And, oh, yeah, let's do a little bit of a power grab and look at those IRA brokerage accounts, because you know what? Defined benefit plans, which is what we really focus on, have gone down, and now it's all kind of self-directed, and there's all these $5 trillion or so in IRA brokerage accounts, so let us, the DOL, grab onto that. So that was kind of the context that we found ourselves in 2010, and then fast forward, that led to litigation, and the DOL rule was ultimately thrown out. In terms of the DOL of today, we are waiting for whatever their new proposal is, but obviously there's been a change in administration. There's a new Secretary of Labor, Gene Scalia. So we'll see what they come up with. We are hopeful, and I guess cautiously optimistic, that it will recognize the SEC is the primary regulator, federal regulator in this space, and whatever they come up with in their proposal will be deferential to the SEC, consistent with the SEC, and recognize that there's a lot of good work that's already been done. Dan may be able to comment on this. From what we hear from SEC officials, they talk about coordination with the DOL and good relationships there. So we would certainly hope whatever the DOL puts out this time around, again, reflects the reality, which is a final regulation best interest at the SEC.
And as one who helped lead the FINRA's response to DOL, and we've met with the DOL staff quite a bit, and I wrote the comment letter for FINRA, I probably developed a bit of a Stockholm syndrome with the DOL staff because I kind of really liked working with them, even though I completely disagreed with everything they were doing. And maybe because of that, I can say one thing positive that the DOL ruled, one positive effect that it did have, which is that it forced broker-dealer firms to very meticulously review their conflicts in a comprehensive way that they may not have done in a while. So that when regulation best interest did come out, I think it made them much better prepared than the DOL. And I think if they were to do all this work from scratch and try to, parse through their compensation arrangements and their conflicts, it would be a much bigger lift right now for the broker-dealer firm.
That's an issue. You've hit upon something I was going to ask, Tom, which was whether that first foray by DOL had any influence on the SEC rule that we can discern and see. It's interesting to hear about behind the scenes how within the community itself there was already kind of a reckoning that was going on. Dan, are you able to talk about either the coordination, which I'm give the standard or whatever, but any lessons you think the SEC picked up from that DOL experience they were doing?
Yeah, so I wasn't integrally involved in the discussions, no longer being on the policy side, but there was a lot of coordination with DOL prior to the SEC rulemaking, on the DOL rulemaking, the SEC rulemaking, and since. continue to be a lot of coordination. Obviously, I don't know where DOL is going, nor if I did, could I talk about it. But, if you look at lessons learned, I come back to one of the reasons that I think the chairman took this on is one of the lessons learned from DOL is there was a sense, a very real sense, that there was going to be limiting investor choice as a result. And that was a result of a final rulemaking that was under its own litigation. But there were market shifts as a result. And that was really one of the underpinnings of the reasons for the commission to act. And that was, I think, the extent of lessons learned, that was a very public one.
And Leo, for yourself, the professionals you guys serve, lessons acquired from either of those experiences, or how are things shaping? Because I also think of you being very intimately involved in the creation of standards and the renewal efforts that have been.
So I guess with respect to DOL and its current status now, what do we know? And what we are hopeful. I mean, we're hoping that DOL comes out with a strong standard when it does issue a standard. What we do know is that the lawyer who is representing the industry challenging the prior DOL rule is now the Secretary of Labor. So I think we're going to have to take a wait and see approach on how this.
Dan, I want to turn back to you because the time hastens on. The mention was made. The head of your department, Pete Driscoll, came out not that long ago talking about we can expect to see a risk alert. So if people say, hey, we're just going to have to see how this thing is going to roll out, have to see how it's examined, have to see how enforcement actions go or private litigation. Can you tell us anything? It's not out yet. Can you tell us anything about what we might be able to expect?
Yeah, so one of the sort of the underpinnings of OC's work is the desire to be transparent about what we do. We have limited resources, we get to limited firms, and we think transparency helps the industry at large, helps investors as a result, that we get the waterfall effect of all firms knowing what we're doing without us necessarily having to do an exam. And our hope and desire and intent is very much to issue a risk alert. That's how we communicate to the public at large and the industry at large in the near term on our plans for Reg BI, and also we haven't mentioned Form CRS exams, sort of in the near term, first year, year and a half, whatever it might be, not particularly time limited. But I think our approach, as we think about it, this is a big undertaking, and this is, I think, sort of a seismic change for broker-dealers, and it is, one of the new core SEC rules in the broker-dealer standards of conduct space. And there's going to be an expectation for us to be able to report back to our bosses, the commission, about implementation, what lessons learned, back to the operating divisions who you'll hear about later, about problems. And I'll make a plug. If you're dealing with interpretive questions, there is an email box that you should email frequently and often and soon, iabdquestions@sec.gov. And there's FAQs being issued as we speak. And there is a desire to get information out because this is a big undertaking. And OC realizes that. And in the first year, I sort of look at it as, I think our idea is it's going to be sort of four corners of the release. And I mean, your exam may differ if you're in the industry, but sort of essentially we're going to be looking at the four components of Reg BI and making sure, or trying to assess whether firms have made a good faith sort of bona fide effort of understanding what the requirements are, implementing them, and building processes around them. This is, I think, we'll see when we get into firms and doing exams, there's going to be learning opportunities for both of us. The industry is going to has a big implementation challenge, and then we're going to find out things that were unexpected going into Reg BI that will hopefully if we can share information more broadly, whether through risk alerts or FAQs, can benefit the industry at large. So we don't intend to be we're not going to look down at the minutia. We're going to look at a good faith implementation, sort of your basic disclosure obligations. Do you have the systems in place? When are you making the required disclosures? Obviously, the content of the disclosures, how you're acting, compensation, proprietary products, and things like that. Duty of care, the information, and this is sort of routine broker-dealer, investor profile information, what you're doing, how you're collecting it. Conflicts of interest is sort of a newer area, and we're going to look for how you address the conflicts and what the approach is. Are you eliminating, mitigating, and the disclosures around them? And then finally, of course, policies and procedures, bread and butter, the compliance program. OC is going to be full on looking at your compliance program, making sure that there are processes in place, dealing with reps, and the like. So we'll hope to get this out. We'll lay out essentially what we're going to look at. Your exams may differ because I'm guessing all exams won't be the sort of full scope, but we're laying out sort of the most significant, or at least if you were to get a full scope Reg BI exam, what to expect. And that document's hopefully working its way out in the near term.
That's great. Really quick follow-up, Dan. Well, of course you know. Who's spearheading that within OC? This being driven by?
It's a group effort. So
Okay.
Our BDX group headed by John Polisi. I'm
Okay.
involved. Pete Driscoll. I mean, this is, as we've said, I think it's clear this is the most significant change, I think, in the brokerage industry, probably since the unfixing of commissions. But this is an SEC rule, and as a result, it is all hands on deck in our broker-dealer program. We have a lot of complementary expertise on the Advisors Act program, dealing with conflicts of interest, being brought into this as well. And we expect to be out with sort of full force on Reg BI, coordinating a lot with FINRA, weekly calls with FINRA, discussing exam planning, because there's a lot to go around here, and we don't want to be duplicative. It's incumbent upon sort of both of us to work together in that regard. Appointing Tom as FINRA. Yes, formerly
And Tom,
FINRA.
maybe that's why you got the heck out of Dodge. That big exam program's about to begin at FINRA. What's going on in terms of prep there?
Well, I'm not at FINRA and I wasn't in charge of the exam program, but I think, I'm sure FINRA's priority is going to be to understand what the SEC expects in terms of the exams, what to focus on, particularly in the initial exams when firms are still preparing. FINRA is going to do, and I believe has probably already begun, some preparedness exams to go in and survey firms to see where they are along. But principally, FINRA is going to take the direction of the commission about what priorities to focus on, at least.
Leo, what about prep work, you guys, or folks who carry your credentials?
So we get asked by the people we certify often, what do these new standards mean, how they're going to play out? And our response is that, that's the SEC's responsibility to provide that guidance, to educate, the affected community for what exactly the standards mean. We adopted our own standards. CFP board went through a long process to come forth with our Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct, which went into effect last October. And we believe very strongly in the idea of guidance, and we support the SEC in issuing guidance. One type of guidance that we found to be very effective is coming out with case studies, providing hypothetical factual situations, explain why, this is the right answer, this is the way you should proceed, this is the way to go, and why these other ways are not useful. And through the accumulation of that type of guidance, through FAQs, through case studies, through the delivery of that, we believe when you have a principles-based standard, that's a very useful way to help educate the affected community about how you can give life to.
Thank you. Well, listen, I want to get to speed round. We're down to 10 minutes. And by the way, I want to invite the audience. Let me ask you right now, raise your hand, come up to a mic if you'd like to say something so I can get you in my viewfinder. I do have a kind of a lightning round for this crowd, but I'm very happy to interrupt that to take questions from this group while you have this terrific panel together. Ira, going into this thing, and thank you for saying at the outset, SIFMA absolutely represents both broker-dealers and advisors, some of the big players. What are some of the fears you're hearing about from firms as we're embarking upon this new regime, as we talk about compliance and the next steps?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Look, I don't think it's really fear so much as wanting to do the right thing. This is a highly regulated industry. Again, our members are both registered broker-dealers and registered investment advisors. They want to comply with the law. Reg BI does a lot, but it doesn't answer every question. So we're all kind of waiting for additional guidance. So we have participated in the process that Dan referenced, and we sent in questions to this IABD email box and have been having good conversations with the staff, and slowly we're getting some guidance there. We will, of course, read every word and every footnote in whatever OC risk alerts come out on Reg BI. And then again, just a practical aspect of this business is when there are enforcement actions ultimately brought, everyone reads the settlement papers and tries to learn from that as well. So anything that can foster additional guidance, ongoing dialogue, because at the end of the day, the firms want to do the right thing. When you have 15,000 or so financial advisors at your firm, there's a whole lot of training, compliance, audit to make sure that everybody is kind of rowing the boat in the same direction and following the rules. So there's a tremendous amount of effort right now kind of gearing up for all that, but this will have to be flexible and able to adjust as we get further guidance from the regulator.
Anybody else on that point? Or jump to my one. I'm going to throw it out there, some chum in the water for folks. We still have that litigation outstanding. Anyone who wants to handicap what they think the likelihood of one or both of those suits prevailing?
Well, I'll take it because I think Dan's under a gag order.
Come on,
I think
Dan.
I'll pass on that one.
So,
Come on, loosen that tie.
So SIFMA, as a trade association, will participate in that litigation by filing an amicus brief, which I think is due March 10th. And we're going to team up with the U.S. Chamber and ACLI, the life insurance trade group. And Commissioner Gallagher's law firm, Wilmer Hale, is representing us on that. So I know we'll have a terrific brief. And look, I get the fact, and I know we have a bunch of economists in the audience, that the economic analysis becomes always under a challenge in these regulatory rulemakings. And maybe the plaintiffs in the state action that you referenced, Jim, is taking that tact. I think at the end of the day, the SEC will win that case. I think they were within their rights to do the rulemaking. They did everything they needed to do. They had the authority under Dodd-Frank. It's a reasonable approach that they took. Litigation obviously is always, there's some element of uncertainty, but I guess I'll go on record as saying the SEC will ultimately win that case.
Yeah, to me, it's a bit paradoxical that if you support the litigation, then you're opposed to a standard of care, basically, because if the states prevail, I don't know when the standard of care will be in.
Anyone want to take the other side of the bet? Won't put anyone on the spot. So it's interesting, well, and not to steal the next panel's thunder, but very interesting whether the views of some of those former economists, what bearing that might have.
I'm not going to posture any views on the current litigation, but being involved in this for 20 years, 18 years, whatever, 20 plus years, this started with litigation about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and maybe ending with litigation. Well, we'll be ending with litigation, perhaps.
Yeah.
Everything in America starts and ends with litigation.
Oh, all those lawyers.
With a lot of economics
Who
in the
for Wilmer
middle.
Hale? I don't know. Yeah.
Don't blame me, I didn't wear a tie. Okay. So, so let's imagine for a moment, and I'm not seeing any hands, so I'm going to keep plunging ahead with our few minutes. Let's say the rule's in place, posit that the challenge is not successful. The rule is here for 5 years, 10 years down from the rule, from where we are now. What are we going to see that's different? Give me a prediction. Are these questions we're talking about, are they going to be resolved? Are they settled? Or is the rule going to have been a success? And let me put a little codicil on the end of that. How do we measure whether this rule's been successful 5, 10 years down the road?
Well, as a former regulator, I can say it's hard to judge how a rule is ever a success because you don't know what would have happened without the rule. But you can generally judge, I think, whether a rule is a failure because either people totally ignore the rule, in which case it's not working, or they comply, but some great alternative has arisen because the rule is too burdensome. So I think if we've decided after 10 years that in fact all the business has moved over to the investment advisor side and it moved at a much more accelerated clip, then I think that we can question whether the rule really provided the investor choice that I think it is going to provide. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think the migration will continue, as I said, but I think it's primarily for economic reasons. And I don't think the commission could have done a better job in establishing a standard that's onerous, that protects investors, but preserves investor choice.
Leo, any thought?
Yeah, I think a couple of the big things to look for are, how is best interest going to be interpreted? Because best interest doesn't mean you have to place the client's interest ahead of yours. It's more of a balanced interest, where you can, as long as your perspective isn't higher than the client's, okay. But, if you look at it, I think the main issue is going to be on this mitigation side. I think the real question is going to be, what is the SEC doing to dampen the effects of these conflicts of interest? How will that play out? How will the SEC interpret that? What will the SEC require? What will the justifications that firms will need to have to explain, for example, while they're making certain investment recommendations? Will there be teeth to that or will there not be? And that area, I think, is going to be the one that's going to have the most significant impact as we look forward to the effectiveness of Reg BI.
So as to whether it's a success or not, there are so many other factors outside of Reg BI that are impacting this industry, and technology is obviously a huge one. Bureau commission. There are 1,000 points of pressure points on this. So, but in isolation, and this is what OC is very prepared to do in the next 5 to 10 years, is our investors getting better advice and better recommendations than they would have been under a suitability standard. And whether it be account selection, rollovers, or security selection. And if they're not, I believe we now have a better suite of tools to then make referrals to enforcement and end up with the public statements as to what this fact scenario didn't look quite up to snuff with the rulemaking and your requirements under Reg BI. So it really is, I hope, in 5 to 10 years, I think that's the whole reason the commission took this on, is that the retail investor, the consumer, is getting better investment advice, less conflicted, and where there is conflicts, there's more information provided to them so they can assess them. It's as simple as that. It's very black and white, but I guess I'm very black and white. The compliance evaluator.
Or anything?
Yeah, I'll do a hybrid of Dan and Tom. I think there's been an increased professionalization in this industry over the last 25 years or so, and I think that's great, and Reg BI will only accelerate that and continue that trend, which is wonderful. But at the end of the day, depending on how the regulation is implemented and enforced, and we will see whether the broker-dealer migration to the RIA only increases or levels off. I think that'll be a big marker of how successful this rule really is.
And to take it back to if I may, back to the very beginning when we were introduced by Professor Rao, there's a wonderful opportunity I think institutions like Texas will have to the business school here in the center to help in the evaluation and the analysis of 5 years, 10 years down the road, what the world looks like. Is there a demographic shift? What are we seeing about investment choice? What are we seeing in terms of, as OC rolls out guidance, FINRA takes the steps that it's taking in terms of compliance and CFP helps its members. Is there an increase in number of people going for certification as people struggle with, the lingering effects of some confusion if it remains in the market? It'll be terrific to see if this program helps shed some light on what the impacts of this rule are.
Yeah, as an alumnus, I say hook 'em horns.
Hook 'em horns, I say. This is terrific. Well, listen, thank you guys very much for your time on the panel. I thought it was terrific. It looks like we didn't have any questions, but grab these fellows, buttonhole them during the course of the day, and we're all very much looking forward to the rest of these proceedings. Scott, thank you.